So during these episodes, I never actually use a script when I'm talking. I'm just kind of basing it off whatever I can, cobble together with obviously, kind of a outline that I got from the internet somewhere in front of me, but it's really just kind of just a roadmap or, the bare bones skeleton for what I talk about mainly from my own knowledge, whatever that may be. Uh, Hopefully, in the future, if these videos um, become more of a success, maybe, or at least if I feel like improving the quality of these videos, I'll probably make a script. But I kind of believe that um, just you know, talking as if these were like the fireside chats of FDR, just talking between you and me, kind of creates this sense of informal intimacy. Um, Nothing too weird, hopefully, but it just kind of hopefully is a bit more relaxing than just me blurting out some facts for some obscure future exam in history or whatever. This is purely for your entertainment and maybe some food for thought. So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about the rise of the Axis powers and the reasons behind the rise of these powers. And it's really interesting because um, if you look at the conditions that led up to the creation of these anti-democratic states, these, you know, ambitious and aggressive and belligerent states that we, today automatically associate with just, unadulterated evil, it's kind of striking how similar they were to the American mentality. And, I'm a sucker for alternate history and what could have been because, at the flip of a dime, it could have happened to the United States. There are so many parallels between both the German nation and the Japanese nation and, what the Americans were experiencing at that time. So the scene is 1926, and Japan has not elected, but just promoted um, Emperor Hirohito, and he was kind of the figurehead, the living embodiment of a god. Just like in Egypt, where the pharaoh was supposedly the living embodiment of a god, and he created this cult of personality around him. And the Japanese absolutely worshipped him, and that is no figurative term. In a very literal sense, the Japanese citizenry worshipped him. Um, before the rise of the fascist, of the totalitarian, of the imperial Japanese government that we know in history today, Japan was embroiled in a fearsome and divisive power struggle between the liberals and leftists on one side and the ultra-nationalists, the ultra-conservatives, the ultra-traditionalists on the other. And um, even in America, and especially in America, you see these ultra-patriots, these nativists, these American purists, and America for Americans. And you wonder how similar our nations were. It only took one Great Depression, one economic, um, albeit, obviously a huge economic catastrophe, not just a little depression, but at the same time, if it only takes some economic hardship for um, what appears to be a well-entrenched, well-endowed democracy to suddenly fall, it kind of is worrying, really. It happened in Germany at that time, and just one after another, as Americans looked abroad to Europe and to Asia, you could just see one formerly democratic nation after another falling to fascism. Interestingly, if you look at Japan in 1925, there was something known as the Peace Preservation Law, quote unquote. That's a very uh, Orwellian term to make. peace preservation was more of a um, more of a bureaucratic term for um, political suppression law, which essentially curtailed massively the political freedoms previously enjoyed by the Japanese citizens in before 1925. And obviously, you know who won um, in the battle between the liberals and the conservatives, the ultra conservatives. Um, Ultimately, the ultra nationalists rose to power and then began to brutally suppress and eliminate, all dissidents and all former um, liberals, on the other side, because that's just kind of what these governments do. And it's very similar, the peace preservation law. It's very similar to um, the laws in the United States that kind of forbade um, the citizens from criticizing the government or the war in times of war, whatever war may happen. The Sedition Act, the Alien and Sedition Act, I believe it was called. And if, further legislation was already built on that precedence that already existed, it wouldn't be too strange. And perhaps if the Great Depression was bad enough and we didn't have a strong president that, captured public approval and public appeal, like FDR, perhaps if we just had another Hoover in office, he would have embodied another weak democracy, and it would have fallen just like the chancellery in Berlin and the democracy in Japan. During World War I, Japan fought on the side of the Allies, and it's a pretty stark contrast from how terribly they cost the Allies, how terribly they resisted and burdened the Allies in World War II, fought against the side they um, previously sponsored, for lack of a better word on the top of my head. But you have to understand the grievances of the Japanese people, and if you look at it, it's kind of very justified in a way that paints the Japanese in kind of a more sympathetic light that gradually diminishes as the Japanese war crimes go on later on. But in the beginning, the Japanese were always um, angered, angered and upset. And these are just very mild words for what the Japanese people were feeling, but they were rejected because of their Asian ethnic, background, even though they had adopted Western ideals and, adopted the Western democracy and adopted, the Western form of government, Western attire, Western culture, but they were still never accepted into the West. And even after they defeated Russia during the Russo-Japanese War, the first time, an Asian nation had completely, decimated a European nation, as strong as Russia purportedly at that time, which shocked the entire Western community. They still didn't gain any respect, or at least the respect they thought they deserved. And even as Great Britain and the United States and, virtually every European nation was going through their own forms of imperialism, Guam and the Philippines and Cuba and Hawaii for the United States, and at one point 1/3 of the entire world for Great Britain. It was highly hypocritical of the world to later, denounce these acts while still the actors enjoying the fruits of their ill-gotten gains. And so the Japanese decided that force was the answer, that this weak Western democracy wasn't going to endow the Japanese with what they deserved. It wasn't strong enough to handle what they wanted. It wasn't strong enough to give them what they wanted, so they simply tore it down. And thus, one of the most brutal, militarily, governments in the world ascended. I kind of maintained the stance that the Imperial Japanese Army was more brutal in many ways than the German army. Um, and I know, you're thinking in your head, well, what about the Holocaust? What about the death marches and the concentration camps in Treblinka and the gas chambers? But you have to understand that, the Japanese, I feel like, took what the Germans did and simply, they magnified it. And in a sense, the Allied wartime propaganda, especially the United States propaganda of these Japanese soldiers being as these almost insect-like, barbaric and fanatic, um, fighters, these crazy, for the emperor, these almost like cultists. Is these images, while obviously crass, are almost true in a way, especially the bit about the brutality. Um, it was said that every Japanese Marine on the islands during the closing um, operations of you know the Pacific Theater, as the noose was tightening on Imperial Japan's neck, every Imperial Marine um, vowed to kill at least 10 United States Marines for every one of theirs they lost. They believed wholeheartedly in fighting and dying for the emperor, even though the war was clearly lost at this point, or at least clearly lost to the rest of the world. And especially in the beginning, before World War II was formally declared, or at least before the United States had entered the war, before France and Great Britain had declared war on Germany after Germany's invasion of Poland, the Japanese were already busy initiating their so-called sphere of the Asian sphere of co-prosperity, or whatever kind of bullshit name they pursued. They enacted. They called their empire the Rape of Nanking, one of the most indescribably brutal occupations, invasions, whatever you want to call it, were enacted by the Japanese. And this was, before, again, World War II had even begun. So you can kind of just see how, I suppose, unrestrained the Japanese army really was at this time. It was their chance, and it's really hard to justify the Japanese soldiers, the Japanese government, the Japanese military at this point. I kind of personally feel sympathy with them in the beginning, being constantly like shadowed by all these, or denounced by all these Western powers that were doing the same thing they were denouncing while simultaneously denouncing you later for doing it, is kind of, hypocritical, contradicting, belittling, and also extremely, racist. So the Japanese simply responded in kind. In 1924, the Japanese enacted an Exclusion Act which prohibited Japanese immigration into the United States. And furthermore, they began their own propaganda, painting, the United States and their allies as these Western, ignorant, greedy, capitalistic, imperialistic powers, and that Japan was simply uniting the whole of Asia to resist these greedy powers. And history is written by the winners, but as the United States has kind of relatively, it's a liberal democracy, so hopefully and obviously that censorship isn't as high as maybe places like in the CCP or in Russia, the Russian Federation, as of right now, as of late. the United States kind of recognized um, that some of these accusations were valid. It's argued that the United States did things that were, maybe I wouldn't say just as brutal, but still, like, if it happened today, it would hopefully be completely denounced by the United States citizens. Its suppression of the Philippine Rebellion. We were pretty much, it was almost straight out of a scene from The Empire Strikes Back. We were the Empire, and we were just slaughtering these um, almost hapless rebels. Well, maybe that's not the right word, because they fought very vigorously, in one of the first examples to the American populace of what guerrilla warfare could really do to an organized army. But, we were the stormtroopers at this point. We were just stormtroopers, and we were shooting at these rebels who simply wanted self-governance and state sovereignty. But at the same time, this time had changed, and it wasn't like this anymore. The League of Nations was conceived after World War I, and you kind of see World War I as the gateway between the Victorian era, right? The Victorian era where, the white man's burden, Rudyard Kipling, imperialism, for God and Queen and country. It's the change, it's the shift between modernity and the Victorian era. And at the same time, things had changed. No longer would it be, at least as acceptable as it was as before, to just take these countries and, invade. For one, these Western powers had already established the clear divisions of their colonial assets. So the oceanic, region, Oceania, had already been kind of divvied up by America and her allies, the Western powers, the European powers. And for another, and this is kind of more of a hopeful and kind of ideological and perhaps even kind of diluted view, but Americans were becoming more aware, en masse. Not just these isolated reporters or isolated denouncers of the government, but kind of more of a collective movement of consciousness and, why should we be doing this, And Japan didn't have that. There was one point in time where China was divvied up by virtually every European nation and America as well. So it was pretty bad for the Chinese. It kind of ended with the Boxer Rebellion, where the Chinese nationalists tried to expel these foreigners, with good reason. And, you associate this with like the Opium Wars and riflemen, in immaculate white suits firing upon these boxers who had, swords, Chinese swords and pitchforks and, muskets. And Japan, I'd imagine, I wasn't in a Japanese government, but I'd imagine Japan looked upon this time and wanted in. But at that point, she wasn't industrially or, militarily equipped to do that. And at the same time, who knew how the Western powers would react? But now the scene was clearing up. And now the Great Depression almost created an opportunity, especially for these ultranationalists in Japan, to rise to power and to take what they believed was rightfully Japan's. Except things, had changed, like I said before, and no longer was it quite appropriate for, one nation to evade another, especially if the latter was, also kind of the assets of other nations around the world. um, it's interesting because this this invasion was extremely brutal in like a systematic, horrifyingly systematic way. Um, Japanese imperial officers, you know, you hear these stories about them bayoneting Chinese prisoners, people who try to resist, people who didn't, indiscriminately for bayonet practice, throwing babies in the air, shooting them for target practice, mass rape. It's almost ironic because in the views of the United States, it was just these vague conceptions of these Asian peoples just fighting against one another, and they didn't even see a clear, dividing line between the Chinese and the Japanese. It's kind of in the same way we view, the American public today, I'd imagine, would view the conflicts in the Middle East between the Sunnis and the Shias. Just this senseless slaughter, this terrible brutality between two groups that aren't even clearly distinguished in their eyes. And to the Japanese, and arguably today to the Sunni and the Shia, the dividing lines couldn't be any clearer. The Japanese, and ironically, saw like the Chinese and the Koreans, and basically every other, Asian nation, Asian country, Asian people, ethnic group as lesser than the Japanese people. And, racially, there's actually proof, actually like with DNA testing and modern science, the magic of modern science. It's pretty obvious, it's pretty evident that, the Japanese people at one point in time descended from the Chinese mainland. And, in time, there grew to be like racial distinctions, but deep down inside, you could argue that the Japanese were just kind of the sisters of the Chinese, but now here they were cutting the Chinese down, butchering them, senseless slaughter. Nothing like the world really had ever seen before, especially on this scale. If you look at, the population of China, it's always been pretty substantial. But at this point, China was kind of an established nation, kind of trying to turn to the Western forms of democracy, Kuomintang. And then it wasn't it wasn't like fragmented powers. It wasn't the war of between like the states, these countless Chinese feudal warlords. It was a consolidated, coherent state, and now Japan was invading it. For multiple reasons, the Americans felt it necessary to intervene. Not perhaps militarily, because there are few in America who are willing to commit American troops and lives and, blood and material, blood and treasure to this vague cause. Probably would be reacted to in the same way if, President Obama got up on stage and decided that he was going to intervene in some particularly brutal struggle between, as I said before, the Sunnis and the Shias. And, furthermore, the United States was also isolationist, stretching back to Washington's farewell address, where the United States was consistently, though, unsuccessfully, I might add, pursuing a policy of isolationism. So few in the government and, in the public wanted to actually intervene actively in this conflict. But sanctions were always an option, just like the sanctions following the Crimean crisis, again, today. And they're easy, relatively speaking, to enact, especially compared to, direct military action. And so it began a gradual process that some historians argue forced the Japanese into war. It began with the banning of some you know, consumer goods, some grains, you know, automobile parts, things like that. But it gradually grew to more, you know, necessary things like oil and raw mineral, like aluminum and airplane parts, and things that the Japanese desperately needed to carry on their war effort. To an extent, the United States financed the beginning stages of the war, of the Japanese War in Manchuria, the Japanese War in China. But now, you know, due to collective, um, you know, like a mild kind of apathetic dislike for the Japanese people and what the Japanese were doing right now, kind of similar to today's mild, you know, the American public's mild dislike for Putin and what he's doing in Ukraine. The Americans gradually began to enact a series of tariffs and embargoes, and we kind of strangled the Japanese people. If you look at the Japanese island, there are virtually no like strategic resources, no raw materials, not on a scale that, you know, the continental United States, and then there's Alaska, you know, rich in oil, rich in wood and timber, and potentially, you know, industrial goods. There was nothing like that in Japan. So in a sense, we almost forced Japan to continue its expansion. Because the more we embargoed, the more they needed to expand to acquire territories that may have had these resources, that may have had these goods.